There's an interesting phenomenon that I've noticed on YouTube, which is when it comes to talking about large, deep topics in gaming, like remake culture, and how these modern game remakes take classics of the past, homogenize all of their unique characteristics, and then use their branding to market what is essentially an entirely different game, tailor-made for mainstream audiences for maximum market value. These topics and ideas are welcomed and celebrated as long as I present them in a generalized form like a video essay, which is great and everything, but what really matters is not video essays, it's not rants or podcasts or general vibing type of content, as fun as that is for exploring ideas. Where these ideas truly matter and need to be applied is in actual specific game reviews. And this is where big-brained game philosophy goes to die, because in specific reviews, you are actually applying real economic value to what you are saying. Reviews are where the rubber hits the road in terms of ideas, and it is very rare or non-existent that today's game reviews will consider what they're evaluating as art. And this is why, if you pay attention to the general behavior in most gaming outlets and YouTubers, you'll notice a strange but funny schizophrenic pattern where gaming as a whole is understood to be in decline and really struggling in terms of quality. But then if you look at actual specific game reviews, we are in an all-time peak in terms of ratings and scores. Every game of passable quality is literally declared a masterpiece, and Metacritic is swimming with perfect ratings. And the frustrating part is, even if you recognize this pattern, its sequence cannot be stopped, which is why I think a lot of the more naturally inclined skeptics of these remakes over the years have burned out and sort of accepted this fate for the medium. And as much as we talk about modern developers being creatively bankrupt and money hungry, I do think there is a deeper reason for this phenomenon than I perceived at first, which is that gaming is not creatively bankrupt, as in developers have ran out of new ideas. We have already passed bankruptcy at this stage. The crash happened without fanfare or recognition. Gaming is now creatively depressed. We are in a gaming depression in terms of creativity and finances. And what I mean by that is, even if developers have a motivation or an idea, they do not have the means to make these ideas happen. Everything the modern gamer palette demands is now too expensive and risky to create without some kind of safety net. Even with well-established IPs that are celebrated, such as Silent Hill, you will see these series all peter out and die somewhere in the late PS3 to early PS4 era, which seems to be the general location where most AAA designs stopped being economically viable. Resident Evil just about shared this fate with Silent Hill, but was rescued, for lack of a better term, by what? Yes, by remakes, or so seems to be the current understanding. You know that scene in Titanic where the crewmen are throwing hot coals into the engine of the ship as water is flooding through the walls, hoping to keep the ship afloat long enough for the rescue boats to arrive? The Titanic are these legacy companies like Konami and Capcom, and those bags of coal are their classic games of the past. In order to keep this capsizing industry alive, these poor games need to be sacrificed and burned for fuel, and everyone on board this sinking ship, developers, publishers, marketers, critics, desperately need to justify this course of action to keep their jobs. And even us as players, even if we're not thrilled with this idea, can't help but end up taking part in this mess because the games are going to get burned. There's no stopping this desperate struggle. These publishers are failing and will do anything they can think of to make money. So then the question becomes, can we, as fans who respect the original games, get any use out of this process? The answer at this point seems to be yes, in theory, but no in practicality. And what I mean by that is, creatively, there's no reason why Konami couldn't make a really interesting reinterpretation of Silent Hill 2, because that is what a remake is, no matter how faithful it claims to be. And what that reinterpretation could build on is the unique identity of the original game, like Shadow of the Ninja Reborn did. But economically, doing something like that with Silent Hill cuts against the whole concept of the modern remake in the first place, which is to establish an economic beachhead for some hypothetical future games that Konami could develop some point in the future. That's the selling point that you often hear anyway. But as a work of art, what makes Silent Hill 2 distinct? What forms its creative identity? For modern developers and modern critics, it's the game's story and visual style. That is all that makes any game individual in their minds. This is why when it comes to controversies or arguments about most modern remakes, the basis of all of these arguments revolve around the story, any political, cultural changes to the story, and the visuals, and any political, cultural changes made to the visuals. This is why I think Silent Hill 2 Remake is a rare moment of peace in this modern gaming remake debate, because it doesn't really have many of these surface elements that would normally get YouTubers fired up, and the developers made an effort to try to recreate the original's gloomy visuals in a modern framework. So this release is ahead of the curve in that sense, which is why I think it is so universally liked. But anyway, the key selling point of modern remakes is to take the aesthetics and narrative elements from classic games and then skin them alive and regraft their flesh onto what is essentially the corpse of an entirely different game. A game that is methodically designed to be accessible and familiar to a mass market, not a game that naturally spawns from the original's unique identity. Let's consider the real Silent Hill 2 for a second. As awesome as that game's story is, and I mean that sincerely, it is one of the few video game stories that I respect, Silent Hill 2 is still a video game that released on the PlayStation 2 with unique gameplay mechanics and structure. These mechanics and structure, like the fixed camera angles and the original pace, contribute to its overall artistic identity. Game design, even minimal game design, is not just a passive container for a story. How you look at the game and interact with it shapes the player's experience in a meaningful way that is key to the medium itself. And the thing about classic games, even if you are a modern player that struggles with them, is that their original identity should not be dismissed as somehow inferior. Silent Hill 2 has a legacy that has stretched over time to the point where now, years later, Konami knows it can be used for marketing a new product. The game isn't perfect, but what really drives me crazy is the tone in which its original design is discussed, because there's this instant assumption that adding in a modern third-person camera and a Pseudo-Souls melee system is instantly and inherently an improvement. Homogenization is just an outright upgrade because this era of gaming is
outdated.
But there's no such thing as outdated mechanics fundamentally. I really want to get this message across, even if the mechanics are clumsy and awkward at times, and the products of hardware limitations and so forth, that doesn't make them outdated, because art is not software. It's not a Windows operating system. I would certainly say that the mechanics of the original Silent Hill 2 are underdeveloped, and that is a more than fair critique. But that's a critique that requires you to actually play the game and get an understanding of what the mechanics are trying to accomplish and how they influence the overall experience of the player. In the modern remake, that's not the idea. Bloober didn't sit down and contemplate how can they build off the original's fixed camera system. How can they develop the existing movement mechanics and melee and the overall weirdness of the original's combat? All this I'll talk about later in the review, by the way. Instead, they just rip out all of the existing systems and then plug in this homogenized formula that people are familiar with and at this point completely expecting. Let's go down the checklist. A third-person unrestricted camera with lots of gun sway.
James.
Nerfed, rather slow movement speed with inertia.
James.
A massively expanded map that insists on lots of micro-backtracking and gates that you unlock around a central save point. Some sort of stealth kill system, obnoxious suck-to-target melee attacks. This is a new one, thanks to God of War. a Souls-inspired parry or iframe dodge, and a whole lot of fiddling and redundant actions. What's funny about these survival horror remakes is that they have more in common with each other than they do their original source material, which I think is the whole idea. It's becoming a genre unto itself, where Konami wants the fan base from Resi 4 Remake and Resi 2 Remake to now hop over into Silent Hill 2 Remake. I don't have any insider knowledge or anything, but I bet that is how Konami pitched the initial idea. Give us Resident Evil 2 Remake and all 14 million of its sales. Like I said earlier, because of the current bleak economic environment, artistic integrity is not a concern strong enough to stop this freight train that is modern remake culture. The benefit it brings studios and the hungry general audience is too strong to deny. Like it or not, this is the new meta. Even snooty critics such as myself are gonna have to adapt to this reality, otherwise what opposing force will exist? IGN and all the gaming websites that they now own, by the way, if you don't know that, certainly are not going to complain. So I think the best thing that can be done is to develop some sort of coherent system to evaluate these remakes without just assuming that they are superior because they are standardized. I think the best method would be to analyze what the new game fails to capture about the original release, because that is a responsibility that it has, and then on top of that, only give credit to the remake for the unique content that it adds in the sense of how it would compare to other games on the market without the excuse of being a remake. Because right now, remakes have this perfect option select where their generic and lame ideas are great because they are updating an old piece of but then if they fail to properly develop the systems that they decide to include, like a combat system, then oh, that's totally fine because that's paying homage to the original game. The original game didn't have a developed combat system, so whatever the new remake does is a overall improvement, right? So basically, no matter what a remake does to the gameplay, it's good. Which brings us to the review proper. Now that I have established this whole framework of how I judge modern remakes, let's get into the specifics because I did play this whole damn thing and I have plenty to talk about. And so to begin, let's start by talking about what I like about the game, because as critical as I am being, I don't think it's terrible or anything like that. I just think it is far from perfect, even in terms of modern game remakes. So the first thing that I really appreciated about the game is the high contrast mode. Accessibility features is actually my favorite thing about modern game design. I think it is something that does improve over classic game design. It's just I do not like it when game journalists and noobs try to put difficulty into the accessibility conversation. There's a real difference between taking a work of art like War and Peace and simplifying it down into a Cliff Notes little reader, which is what they want to do with difficulty, versus taking War and Peace and translating it into Braille for blind people. I'm in the blind people category here because as I was playing through, I was having a lot of trouble early on with the low visibility, the constant being in dark hour after hour. I was getting a lot of eye strain and wondering, okay, am I gonna have to rent a seeing eye dog to get through the rest of this review? So I went to the accessibility options and found this high contrast mode, which is really great for being able to see the game, see the enemies. It's kind of funny how much it clarifies the game's design and shows what is really going on. I think they overdid it a little bit, I'll be honest, with how strong the contrast is. There's no slider to like lower it a tiny bit, which I think would have been nice, but still, being able to see really was important for me, so I did like this accessibility feature. The second thing I appreciated about this game is its Spartan approach to doing a modern remake. And I don't know if this is a creative choice or just being extremely economical. I kind of suspect it's the latter. But what I mean is that usually with these modern remakes, they add in all these superficial elements to make the game seem deeper than it actually is, like RPG leveling on the weapons or crafting systems and all of this sort of fiddliness, as it's called. I do appreciate that Remake Hill 2 didn't take this approach, and the weapons just have solid stats, solid properties, and I do like how more honed in and minimal this remake is in these regards. Also, very few walking and talking sections and cinematic type of stuff. There's tiny bits of it here and there, but nothing as excessive as we normally get. You're not carrying Maria through a hallway for an hour or whatever the hell a lot of these modern remakes do. I think a lot of this sort of stuff is why this game is getting a lot of positive praise, because people, I think, are sick of this crap, but they maybe don't realize it necessarily. They don't realize they're sick of walking and talking sections. They're sick of dumb, meaningless RPG mechanics. They're sick of all these sort of fake depth systems. Same thing with the combat mechanics. The combat mechanics of Remake Hill 2 are extremely basic, but most modern games coming out now have extremely basic combat systems when you actually study how they work. But what I do appreciate, this is one element of the combat appreciate. There's still a lot of problems I'll talk about later, but one thing I appreciate about the combat system of Remake Hill 2 is it doesn't pretend to be deep and complex. It actually plays in a Pseudo-Souls style, very similar to Stellar Blade, but the difference here is that this game just has the iframe dodge and attack. That's all it has. And when it comes down to it, when you're playing Stellar Blade, that's kind of basically the same thing. You've got the parry, the iframe dodge, and homing attacks. But Stellar Blade presents itself as this deep Devil May Cry type of system with all this great stuff happening, where this game's like, yeah, you're just iframe dodging and hitting things. That's all we're doing here. But it is kind of refreshing. They didn't put in perfect parries or meaningless stat trees where you unlock getting off the ground or you unlock basic functions like stomping on people. I do like that the combat system is fairly static pretty much throughout the entire game. I think they could have really expanded on it and developed it more, but I do like that it doesn't try to pretend to be more than it is. So the first major critique of this game that I have is its decision to adopt the generic, often used, third-person, Last of Us style camera system and that whole approach. And that is the approach that is just the given when it comes to these modern remakes. It's not even questioned. It's not even thought about. You read the reviews, you read the people talking about the remake, and it's just like, yeah, put in a modern third-person generic camera system, and it's an improvement. Boom. That's the main selling point. That's the whole reason to do a remake, because modern gamers and modern critics, they hate camera systems. I don't know what it is, but the concept of the camera system, especially these fixed cameras that Silent Hill 2 makes, these need to be reevaluated a little bit. There needs to be a pause here because they achieve a lot in terms of how you interact with the game that I think modern gaming audiences would appreciate if they're a little bit more open-minded, because when it comes to Silent Hill 2, it's clear that the original is trying to achieve a cinematic filmmaking type of experience. And when I say cinematic, I mean in a filming sense, in an Alfred Hitchcock, Kubrick sense, not in a modern gaming sense of big cutscenes and anime. I mean cinematic in terms of angles of the camera, perspective, who is looking at what, where. When you think about especially horror films, you think about just filmmaking generally, cinematography is like one of the major branches of film. It's what makes film set apart from all the other mediums. And there's this real desire among gamers, you see it all the time, they want to achieve that in their medium. But ironically, all the places where you could maybe put that into a gaming infrastructure are rejected as just clunky and outdated, like these fixed camera angles, because the perspective of the camera creates a tone. Kubrick was a master of this. And with Silent Hill 2, the original, the way these fixed camera angles work, they can cut up the map and environment and create a distinctive feeling as you're playing through. So The thing about the remake that's a real problem is when you give the player this generic third-person camera that they fully control, whose perspective are you looking at when you're playing Silent Hill 2 Remake? You're looking at your perspective, and you're fully in control of your perspective. And if you're scared, you can always just turn the camera and peek. And when it comes to going through the apartments and going through the hospital and the scarier areas of the game, all you have to do is just adapt this SWAT tactical approach with your camera system where you come in, turn, hug the wall, clear, turn, hug the wall, clear, like you're playing Rainbow Six or something like that, because you are fully in control of your movement, you're fully in control of the pace, you're fully in control of the perspective. So the only suspense the game can actually throw at you is low light, is giving you this little flashlight and hoping that when creatures scuttle across it, you go, oh my God, what was that? And then you, oh. But that wears off really quickly, especially if you just use this SWAT tactic of clearing rooms. Nothing's gonna really jump out at you and surprise you. And then ironically, like I said, this constant low light was giving me eye strain, so I played with high contrast mode. And then when you play with high contrast mode, that's it. All suspense is removed because you can see everything. So it's actually funny now when you see the little mannequins dancing and crawling around because you're like, I can see you behind the wall there. You're not tricking me. So that's the problem with this fully controllable player camera, is it completely removes the cinematic, surreal perspective of the original game. Whereas with the original game, it doesn't need low light necessarily, because you can always create suspense with the angles of the camera. And you're always asking yourself, whose perspective is this? It's not James. It creates the feeling of being watched. And then the enemy placement can complement the fixed camera angles because they can stick enemies right outside of the angle of the camera in a lot of these rooms. So even if you can fully see the room, you're still like, ooh, what's around that corner? Because you can't see around the corner. There is this strong director's vision of what you can see when, and it creates a lot of subtle suspense that you don't pick up on necessarily if you don't think about it. But like, for example, when you're running down a hall, the way the camera is angled, when you're running forward into the camera, you can't see what's ahead of you. You have to just blindly run and just hope, oh, I hope something's not gonna hop out at me. And it creates a suspense as you're doing it. You're running, you're like, Jesus Christ, I hope there's not a dude waiting and I'm gonna run straight into him. But you can't do the whole third-person camera system of just like sneaking along and creeping and being careful. You have to like commit to, I'm running through this hall and I'm gonna try to react to what happens. It creates a real fixed sense of pace, and it cuts up the game a lot visually in cool ways. A great counterpoint is the opening of the game in the original versus the opening of the game in the remake. The opening of the game in the remake is absurd because if you have full control of the camera system, it's just you running on a path for like 4 or 5 minutes. Nothing is happening. There's no suspense created. You can see all around you. You're just running on a path. It might as well have cut it. There's no point for its existence. In the original game, it at least gives you time to kind of get used to the fixed camera system. I think that's the idea, because you're moving along this path, but it's getting cut into all these different angles, like you're being watched. Things are watching all around you. Something's ahead of you, something's behind you, something's to the side. And so as you're running along the path and you're hearing sounds off to the side, but then the camera shifts direction, it creates a sense of disorientation. And that's what this game does extremely well in the original, is it's constantly disorienting you. And the thing about modern critics is they probably think, oh, this is just bad game design. But I think it's fantastic game design for what this game is going for. This isn't Devil May Cry. It's not a game that precision matters. It's a game all about traversing through the maps. So at least cutting the maps into unique angles and unique perspectives adds a lot more to its visual style. Why don't you just build off of the original concept, which is you keep those fixed camera angles, and then you bring in this lock-on style system with the gun combat and with the melee combat, which the original game was going for, and you could just develop it a lot more. And it would be cool, and it would really stand out. these days. If that type of system appeared in a horror game with fixed camera angles, but it's developed, it's improved, it would stand out a lot more. But as it stands now, with Silent Hill 2, with its camera system, with its combat system, its gun mechanics, it's like, oh yeah, I've played this game 10,000 times. I don't even play this genre all that much. And it's instantly Resident Evil 2 Remake, it's Last of Us, but in Silent Hill's skin. So that's one of my main criticisms of this remake, is that in terms of unique identity, it'll be interesting because I think we're in this trend right now of this is how it is and this is how it's done. But I'm hoping in the future, 10 years from now or something, a lot of these concepts that were lost in the previous era, like fixed camera angles and forced perspective, will get rediscovered. And we'll look back on this era and be like, can you believe there was a time in gaming where everyone insisted that all games had homogenized camera systems? To me, that seems a lot more reductive than the craziness that was going on in the PS2 era with the more experimental camera systems. At least it was doing something unique and interesting. The second big critique I have of this game is its bloated pace, because the whole concept of the original Silent Hill 2 is to go through this environment, to go through this story, and get it all in a pretty condensed sitting, all things considered. An average playthrough of Silent Hill 2, How Long to Beat is Wrong, is about 5 hours if you're just playing through the game and going through and you kind of know what you're doing. You get about a 5-hour playthrough. In terms of like game stories, that's like the equivalent of a film. And the game is paced, and the levels are paced, and the dynamics are all paced around this runtime. It doesn't overstay its welcome. Whereas with this remake, it massively overstays its welcome. And it actually is the biggest problem I have with this game in terms of just my personal replays, because usually what I do is when I play through a game the first time I learn it, I'm always very excited to play through it again. The second playthrough I think is always much better than the first playthrough. But the problem with this is, okay, I'm going to play through it again just to see how I feel for the review. And then I get about to the apartments, and you're getting to the parts where they're fragmenting keys, and you're getting keys of keys, and then you're backtracking, mini backtracking I like to call it, through the areas over and over and over, and it just becomes this tedious fetching checklist. And I know this is how modern games are developed. This isn't unique to Silent Hill 2, but it really stands out in Silent Hill 2 Remake because they are using the original game's structure, but then bloating its pace massively and not adding any meaningful justification for the longer runtime. It's like if you take a film, let's say Taxi Driver, and now let's expand it into a TV series. If you just want to play Silent Hill 2 and learn its style and story, I would still recommend just play the original game for pure convenience, because how long it's going to take you to get through this remake without much more meaningful gameplay. Fun little fact that not a lot of people know is you don't actually have to play the original Silent Hill 2 with a tank control. You actually can go into the options and change it to 2D mode, which gives you that direct Devil May Cry style movement, which is so much better in my opinion. Yes, it's a little funky with some of the camera changes, but not that big of a deal. So if you want the original game to control a lot better, just change it to 2D mode. But in terms of the game's pace, it is straight up underdeveloped. There's not enough material here to justify the amount of time the game wants to spend in these environments and levels. And the way it creates this dynamic, and this is like a little trick that modern games have figured out that I don't think gamers have quite picked up on, is what I like to call micro-backtracking. So macro-backtracking, that's a no-no these days. Developers know you can't do that. They can't do the Metal Gear thing and the Devil May Cry 4 thing of making you go back through entire environments. They know you're not going to like that. But what they can do very effectively is trick you into just traversing this same segment of an environment over and over and over again with no meaningful gameplay interaction. And so with Remake Hill 2, what was once like one key is like 6 keys, and then they'll put keys of keys on top of keys. It gets to be absurd. And as I was playing through this style of level design, which the way it works is you come into an environment, it has that central save point, and then you go around the environment, run around the environment, and go from room to room, and you have to like jigsaw your way through all the rooms and accumulate all the keys into one final ultimate group of keys that then opens the final door that then goes into the next section. And I was sitting and thinking, like, why is this so familiar? Outside of playing games, I really recognize this style of game design. Where does this come from? And I realized, oh, this is an escape room. This is how modern games are designed. If you've never been in an escape room, all these modern games are escape rooms where you go into a room. They actually have timers, which I think is cooler, but you go into a room and it's just filled with keys, and you have to go through a sequence of keys that unlock other keys, because in an escape room, they have this contained environment. So how do they make use of the entire contained environment? They just make keys upon keys upon keys upon keys, and they're able to maximize that little environment. Game developers must have gone to an escape room and walked out and been like, level design, fuck that. We'll make everything an escape room. And for the first large section of the game, I don't know how long, but it's hours, you really just run into 2 enemy types. And there's no variety in the combat. Once you understand the sequence, you just do it over and over again. 2 enemies. And this persists for a really long time. Then you finally get to the hospital. Oh my God, 3 enemies. 4 enemies if you count the knife-wielding version of the nurses. But with how sparse the enemy types are, how sparse the boss fights are, and you compare this to something like Resident Evil 4, the real one, think about how many enemy types and boss fights and encounters are stacked upon each other by the time you get to the end. And I know you could say, well, Silent Hill 2 isn't Resident Evil, which I understand, but that goes back to the original point of pace, where Silent Hill 2's design is only able to really sustain itself for the original runtime. It doesn't have enough combat dynamics. It doesn't have enough to sustain itself for a 15-hour campaign. If you want a campaign that long, you're gonna have to start radically introducing a lot more material into this formula. So the pace and all the micro-backtracking for me, in the end, is the biggest deal breaker for me replaying the game or continuing to want to play the game into the future. Because even if you kind of get to the funner sections like the boss fights and the later parts of the game where you get finally all the enemy types together and that kind of stuff, like that part of the game, it starts to heat up. But this middle and beginning part, the 2/3 basically of all this filler, is just this giant slog. And then of course we've got to talk about the combat of the game, because with the modern remake, the biggest selling point potentially had to be the combat. Because when you're playing Silent Hill 2, the original one, you're sitting and thinking to yourself, okay, what could be really improved here? What could be really expanded upon? And of course, it's the combat. I don't think anyone's mentioned this or pointed this out before, but the original James in Silent Hill 2, that dude is like a track star. He has got some feet. He can really move. And that is also what helps give the game a lot of pace. But it comes up a lot in the combat as well, because the original game's combat, it actually has a lot more going on than I think people realize, than even I realized, because it's funky and weird, but there are layers to it. For example, when you're first playing Silent Hill 2, you probably think, oh, there's only one attack type because there's only one attack button. And in the remake, it's the same way, there's only one attack type. But actually, in the original, there are multiple attack types, but they are pressure sensitive to the buttons because the PlayStation 2 is crazy like that. So if you like lightly tap the attack, you'll get a light attack. And then if you hit it hard, then you get the two-handed heavy attack. And then there's also weird hidden attacks that I'm not even sure now how they work. I've just seen other players do them. Like there's a stabbing type of attack, and there's a shitload of hit stun. That's really important too. So the original game's combat, you can actually move around and run while wielding your weapon. That again is something you kind of have to figure out. But ultimately, it kind of plays like a sort of Bushido blade type of thing. Once you get that initial hit, you kind of have them locked. But then when it comes to dealing with multiple enemies, the original game is all about like spacing them out and moving around them and really making use of James's movement speed. And even stuff like the Pyramid Head boss fight is more fun than you would expect because you can trigger certain attacks based off of your spacing Dark Souls style and then use his movement speed to get in and out of attack ranges. It is kind of like a Proto-Souls style in that it has a lock-on system, but it doesn't have that dodge roll, but you use a lot of like spacing and movement and hit stun to deal with the enemies, which is kind of fun. It's, again, underdeveloped, but there's something there that's pretty cool. And they could have really expanded upon that, I think. But instead what we get is, of course, just this new, what I like to call Pseudo-Souls style of combat, where they come in and they bring in the iframe dodge, which I do appreciate more than the parry. I will give them that. I'm really glad they went with that instead of the parry, because that opens up more neutral game and spacing in the best parts, like the double Pyramid Head fight. So I do like that they went with that instead of a parry. But then, of course, they reduce the movement speed down and they make it to where everything really tracks. This is the Pseudo-Souls signature. You have the iframe dodge or parry. Everything freaking tracks. There's massive amounts of tracking on your side and the enemy side. So it's like that Batman Arkham sort of feel a little bit, but not as bad, where everything just homes in on each other. You home in on them, they home in on you. That really granular neutral spacing of the original game, of stuff like Dark Souls, that's all removed because you suck to target, as the God of War developers call it. And this is a way to make what could be a more vague combat system almost turn-based. And even when you read guides for playing Silent Hill 2 Remake, they will say stuff like, wait your turn, because it is becoming much more of a sort of soft turn-based system where you can't really do that much, even if you get the positioning advantage, because the wind-up of your attacks takes so long. You can't cancel the end of your attacks. You can cancel the initial wind-up into a dodge. They had to do that, otherwise it would be insane with the auto homing in. But you auto home in, they auto home in on you, and then you use the iframes of your dodge. And it creates this really rote sequence that just repeats because there's no variation. You don't have a light attack anymore. You can get a little bit of an advantage on your iframe dodges maybe. You can get an attack out slightly faster if you dodge really precisely. But then on top of that, to make it even more turn-based and automated, they have what I call Pseudo-Stun, which is not to be confused with true hit stun. True hit stun is in the original game, where if you get that pipe or that melee thing on top of the guy, they're locked in. You've got them. And it's reliable, and you can base your combat around that. Pseudo-Stun, the way it works is it looks like hit stun, but it is not reliable and it is not true. A quick way to test if a game has Pseudo-Stun is if your attack hits your enemy in a neutral state, but they initiate a counter attack anyway, which undermines the concept of frame advantage because you cannot reliably predict if your opening attack will be punished on hit or not. So the default just becomes to bait the enemy to attack first in neutral, and then you will get a reliable punish, versus in a true hit stun system where getting the initial hit is extremely valuable in what you are looking at in neutral. In short, with true hit stun, it's the player who sets the pace of the combat, but with Pseudo-Stun, it's reversed, where the enemies set the pace of the combat and you are locked into their predetermined timers. So it ends up being a lot more automated and passive and shallow, in my opinion. And so if you want to play consistently, you have to just fall back on taking turns. Hitstun is a consistent principle that you can build an entire game plan around. Devil May Cry, Ninja Gaiden, all the great character action games have true hitstun because you need to deal with multiple enemies and you need to have a reliable way to interact with multiple enemies. But with these Pseudo-Souls games, you can't deal with multiple enemies. If two enemies group up on you, you're going to get screwed because you can't deal with asynchronous attacks because there's no hitstun. You can't do something like in a character action game where you hit one guy and stun him and then move to the next guy and like group them up and stun them together. Resident Evil 4 has this dynamic with the knife, and with a lot of the weapons, it has true hit stun where you can stun the enemies, group them together, then kill them together. In these Pseudo-Soul styles combat system, you can't do that. You can't group enemies together because your basic attacks don't deal true hit stun. And if the enemies get asynchronous with one another, if their attacks start to offset, it's impossible. You can't deal with it. You have to just retreat and deal with them one by one. In Pseudo-Souls, all the enemies are balanced around one-on-one encounters, and that is how the game is meant to be played. And it works fine enough in this game in the sense of functionality, because if you have multiple enemies, you just shoot them or you lead them away from each other. I mean, there's lots of tactics you can use to deal with this, but the underlying dynamic is what I'm talking about here, because when you mix together the very minimal amount of enemies, and then you have in this very sequenced-based style of combat, that removes a lot of the granularity you get from a combat system that uses free swinging and real spacing. What ends up happening is it's very easy to pick up and learn the style of combat system, and that's why modern remakes and modern developers use it. But the trade-off is once you learn it and you learn its meta, kind of it. There's not really a lot of places to go from here, because one source of depth that character action games have, and a lot of beat 'em ups and a lot of action games have, isn't just one-on-one fights, it's groups of enemies. Enemy dynamics when they combine together. That's where you get most of the depth in combat-oriented games. But when you have this Pseudo-Souls style, heavily disincentivizes that group dynamic, and then on top of that just makes one-on-one encounters really static. It's really lame. It's really boring, especially because this game has so few enemy types, so few boss encounters. It just really kills the replayability of the game. I do want to point out some of the highlights of the game's combat to show where it could have gone and how it could have worked a lot better. The definite highlight of the game in terms of combat is the double pyramid head fight, if you decide to fight them with just your steel pipe. And the reason for that is the game finally starts to play with the dynamic of real spacing, because the pyramid heads, unlike most of the other enemies of the game, don't have insane tracking on their attacks. It uses more fixed attacks, so you actually can sort of space around them. Yes, you have to use your iframe dodge, but where you go after that iframe dodge actually matters because there's two of them. And so what the meta becomes in this pyramid head fight, which I think is interesting, and this is something that could have been built upon more, is you have two enemies that have more fixed type of attacks. And then what you have to do in order to successfully combat them both without getting killed is you have to sync them up. So you'll see me doing that a lot here. I did manage to do it. And you have to account for one as you fight the other. That is something that adds depth and that is interesting. And even though it's kind of janky, and I don't think the average player is going to do this, because you actually have to think more long term in the fight. Like, all right, even though I have the advantage here, I can't attack because they're out of sync. I need to wait for them to sync up together. That was a dynamic that I thought was really cool. The second area that I want to highlight that I really liked was that escape sequence after the hospital, where you're going through the town and it's covered in all the different enemies, and you actually now start fighting groups of different enemies together. This comes in the labyrinth as well. Having the enemies grouped up together, again, even though the game system isn't really designed to withstand this, is still a lot more interesting to finally deal with. And you finally get that real dynamic from the original game of, do I run or do I fight? And so you finally have a little bit more meaningful decision making with the combat system, with how you interact with the enemies, knowing, all right, I'm going to pick off this enemy type first because they're easier to pick off, and I'm going to deal with this enemy type. So the end of the game finally starts to get enough enemy variety, which isn't a lot, but that level of, difficulty and depth, what I think should be more of a baseline. And then as the game continues, it should be a lot stronger. Same thing with the boss fights. The boss fights were pretty fun, but there's not that many of them. And it takes so long to get to them that, again, they feel a little anticlimactic. So the combat isn't terrible, but it's extremely shallow, and I am not a fan of this new trend of suck to target. I really hope this starts getting dropped, because you could have had something really fun if you just kept it a little bit more open-ended. Like if you allowed James to use more of his movement, cut down on the inertia, reduce the amount of iframes on the iframe dodge, but give him more movement, speed, pick up the pace of the attacks a little bit, maybe give you a light attack, put some real hit stun in there. They could have done a lot, even with just this basic template, and made it a lot more fun and engaging in the end, and you're dealing with multiple enemies and stuff like that. But anyway, let's get to my final thoughts. Overall, Silent Hill 2 Remake isn't a bad game in its own terms, especially with all the stuff that's coming out now. I could understand that in comparison to what modern games are like and playing modern games, I could see it being actually a breath of fresh air. And I do think this is why people are less harsh than I think they should be on these remakes, because we're in desperate times and people are like, all right, it's not for real, it's not really that great, but I need something. And so here we go. And we're dropping our standards. And you can see it in real time how pathetic our standards are getting. Go read some of the reviews of this, like the Eurogamer review, which is a perfect score, by the way. And you read the tone of that review, and it sounds like the type of reviews people used to write on GameFAQs in middle school. Super Mario All-Stars, 10 out of 10. The greatest game of all time. You know, you're putting that in GameFAQs and stuff. Like, that's the level of analysis and critique we have for these remakes at this point. Silent Hill 2 Remake, it's not the worst thing in the world, and I can see Team Bloober really trying in the parameters that they think they need to operate in, and Konami needs them to operate in these modern game parameters. Like I said, it's almost impressive how scientifically it applies the remake culture to Silent Hill 2. It's like generated exactly by the specifications. Like, you took a sheet of what would a remake of Silent Hill 2 look like? And it's like, there it is. It's like everything you would expect to be there in modern remakes is there, and nothing more. They're not doing anything beyond what usually gets these remakes in trouble, with lots of changes and lots of updates and all that kind of stuff, and people argue. None of that is really present, though they did remove the scenes of Pyramid Head with the mannequins. I noticed that little bit of sterilization, like, ooh, no, that's a little too much maybe for modern audiences. And I don't think anyone's going to comment on that, but if you're a fan of the original story, there's some sanitization for you. And so do I recommend the game? I'm sort of neutral on this one, where if you're part of the more classic gaming style and my general audience base, you don't need to play this. I think you should go back and play the original Silent Hill 2, though, and check that out. Play with the 2D controls. And that one is, I think, a lot more interesting than this remake. But if you're in this demographic of players out there where you will not play older games, you're just like, no, I will not play a game on the PlayStation 2 with fixed camera angles. And I have many of these people in my personal life, my personal friends. So if I try and get them to play Resident Evil Mercenaries, they won't do it because they have to have modern controls and modern camera systems. And so if you're in this demographic, I urge you to drop this mentality if you can. But if you live in just this world where you're only going to be playing stuff like Resident Evil 4 Remake and Alan Wake 2 and all of these mainstream type of games, Silent Hill 2 is probably gonna be a breath of fresh air compared to those ones, because it is more like Spartan and sparse and more to the point by those standards. But for like the audience base who likes the more classic style design, I really instead urge you to revisit the original game, check it out. It is interesting. I actually really appreciated going back and playing the original and kind of researched my interest of, all right, I should go back and play all of these kind of classic survival horror games, like the older Resident Evils and the older Silent Hills, because there's more to them than I gave them credit for initially. So there is that, which is pretty cool. So if you enjoyed this review, I definitely recommend checking out a video of mine that I made recently called Why Permadeath Matters. I think it's a great companion piece to this discussion of modern game design versus classic game design and what differentiates between the two. And then also, if you can, I am a full-time YouTuber now. So if you enjoy the style of content, I'd really appreciate, if you can, supporting me on Patreon. I've got upcoming next month 2 really cool additions to the Patreon in terms of content that I think people will be really excited for. So keep an eye out for that. Thanks so much. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100, Absconditis, Accepting Panda, Anhold, AJA, Alistair Stevenson, Alexander Pfeiffer, Ali Hashmi, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Au Ali, Autonamed, B-Lit, Beam Pit, Bo, Ben Foster, Beto Dames, Blade Symphony, Boghog, Board Basmati, Borgie22, Chad Memphis, Chase Palumbo, Che Phillip, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Clara Cliff, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Cooksan666, Cooksum Soup, Corio, Crump 12, Des Audio, DRK, Dances with Incels, Darren Griffin, Dave Hansen, David Aldris, David Crespo, Did I Done, Demian Smirnov, Desolus, Dingo, Dio, DJ420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Eduardo, Edvard, EJ, Elvin Senesev, Eleanor Moon, Elias Alonso, Eric Houdini, Evie Zerker, Falkis, F Deluxe, Fenich, Fiskin, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Game Soup, Game Boy Guru, Gojira Green, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hawk, Hans Kowalski, Hausu, Hero Death, Ikihime, Hanharthi, HUD, Hugh Mungus, JDab, Jake Ryan, Jack Walls, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, JLab, JBRPG, Jeremy Kellner, Jink Hans, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, Josh Mayer, Julian Elwood, Jurgen, K, K2, Ken 10082, Kiss Kissian, Contain, Praise the Boys, Langoblian, Ludwa, Walberta, Lord Harrington, Lorian, Mad Combaticus, Malaise, Mario Simic, Mark Sloan, Mars Bar, Master Zeon, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Maz, Mecha Roca, Minang, Meister, Metal Slime Drummer, New Jam, Michael Polito, Michael McCord, My Liddy, Mike Mel, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Morog, Monroe, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Pero, Neondagger Games, Nervous J, Ogla Kugels, Patrick Basteman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Powell Parole, Pedro Isilis, Phil Oz, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, Cycle Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Quinlan Yeager, R2 Sinus, Ralph Trujillo, Raul, Rapido, RC, Real Skeen, Rent Holt's Time, Retrojet, Retroman, Retro Schmupper, Ricky, Riff Mason, Rip the Jacker, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Salmon Connections, Senevo, Scanline City, Segfault, Shantak, Shazzy, Shmup Junkie, Shmup Run, Sirapong, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steven Bridges, Defilable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Swoop, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, Yol Bensta, Tim French, Travis Arbon, Troop Good Guy, Tsugumo, 2IU, Twes Please, Twilight EX, Tyler Olu, Unikoi Roots, Ursua, Ushimushi, Vic Viper, Beautiful, Rena, Wabby Legs, What Is This? Your Nerdy Joe, Zachary Patton, Zeal, Zeno, Zen Ryoku.